September 24th, 1940. Before sunrise touched the horizon, the cramped basement beneath the old munitions building in Washington, D.C., hummed with the soft vibrations of machines that had no right to sound as calm as they did. The room, windowless and sealed off behind layers of locked doors, was illuminated only by a series of low-hanging lamps whose glow turned the concrete walls into muted canvases of pale gray. Paper cabinets lined the edges of the space like sentinels, each drawer filled with intercepted messages whose significance had yet to be fully understood. The floor smelled faintly of ink, rubber insulation, and the warm metal of overworked electrical circuits. And in the center of the room stood a machine that resembled neither a typewriter nor a radio, but something in between, a machine that seemed, even in silence, to anticipate revelation. It was here at 5 in the morning that a man wearing a rumpled khaki shirt and the weary eyes of someone who had slept too little placed his hands on the prototype decoder that he and his team had built piece by piece. Lieutenant Commander Joseph Rockefort, already balding at 39 and carrying the quiet intensity of a man who lived half his life inside intercepted transmissions, adjusted the tuning dials with a slow precision that betrayed both exhaustion and resolve. The hum of the machinery deepened. Paper fed through the output roller in hesitant increments. A faint scratching sound followed, like the first marks of ink on a fresh page. The intercepted Japanese diplomatic message on the table beside him bore the familiar structure of coded traffic transmitted from Tokyo to its embassy network. The Americans knew the format. They knew the rhythms. They had captured thousands of similar messages over the past months. But they had never read one in its original form. Not truly, not fully. The encryption system that the Japanese Foreign Ministry called Purple had resisted every effort to break it. For 2 years, it stood as a fortress of rotating electrical switches and permutation patterns that shifted faster than any human mind could track. American cryptanalysts had probed at its edges, searching for weaknesses, always coming away with fragments, but never meaning. This morning felt different. Not because the message was unique, or because the machines hummed louder, or because Rockefort felt a sudden surge of inspiration. It felt different because of a subtle alignment of calculations, failures, hypotheses, electrical circuits, and quiet obsessions that had finally converged into a moment of clarity. The device on the table, constructed not through espionage but through deduction, was now tuned according to a breakthrough made just 2 days earlier. A pattern that had haunted the team for months seemed, at long last, to resolve itself into coherence. The machine stuttered. Then it steadied. Letters began to emerge on the output tape, spaced evenly, no longer random characters, but symbols of meaning. Rockefort leaned closer. His fingers hesitated above the paper. The message, still incomplete, unfolded line by line in front of him, revealing structure, grammar, intention. The Purple Code, a creation of mathematical precision meant to shield Japan's most sensitive diplomatic communications, had begun to speak. Outside the building, Washington remained cloaked in darkness. A thin wind brushed against the leaves scattered across Constitution Avenue. Street lamps cast circular pools of amber on the pavement. Cars were sparse. The city had not yet fully awakened to the war unfolding beyond its borders, not yet realized how profoundly the world had begun to shift. For now, the details of the war moved through telegraph wires and radio waves, intercepted signals, and censored newspapers. But here, in this quiet basement, the war's future took shape with each emerging letter. Inside the room, the machinery continued its steady rhythm. Panels clicked softly. Relays snapped into place. The device's circuitry, arranged meticulously by a team of engineers and mathematicians, replicated the logic of the Japanese cipher machine without ever having seen the original. It was a feat of reverse engineering that bordered on the impossible. And yet it worked. lines of Japanese diplomatic text, written in Romanized transcription but carrying the weight of coded meaning, flowed onto the tape. Rockefort exhaled slowly. The tension that had gripped his shoulders for months began to loosen, though only slightly. His eyes scanned the words. He recognized sentence structures typical of dispatches from the Japanese Foreign Ministry: formal, technical, nuanced. The words were not military orders or battlefield reports. They were diplomatic in nature, the outward facade of international communication that belied the undercurrents of strategy and ambition. But what mattered was not the content of this particular message. What mattered was that the code had yielded. The fortress had been breached. Upstairs, the stillness of pre-dawn Washington held firm. The city's monuments stood silent beneath the faint glow of the coming sunrise. But inside the intelligence corridors of the Navy Department, small movements had already begun. As the decoding machine continued its work, analysts in other rooms stirred awake, drawn by the sudden shift in energy that seemed to ripple through the building. Doors opened. Footsteps pressed against linoleum floors. People arrived with cups of coffee and stacks of declassified intercept logs, unaware that a threshold had been crossed moments earlier. Rockefort removed the paper tape from the machine and carried it across the room to a long table cluttered with reference charts and dictionaries. He placed the tape gently on the surface, flattening it with his hands. He studied the lines again. His eyes narrowed. The encryption patterns matched the structure predicted by his team's most recent model. That was the confirmation he had needed. The machine had done more than guess. It had read. The moment settled over him like a slow-building weight. He understood the significance immediately, not as a burst of triumph, but as a realization that the quiet work of months had finally revealed its purpose. The Japanese diplomatic network, one of the most guarded communication systems in the world, had opened itself to American eyes. Beyond the walls of the building, across thousands of miles of ocean, Japanese diplomats tapped out coded messages on their purple machines, confident in the invulnerability of their ciphers. They believed their words traveled in perfect secrecy from Tokyo to Berlin, Rome, and Washington. They believed their intentions were shielded behind layers of electrical complexity. They believed the Americans, preoccupied with European war and political hesitations, would never penetrate their communications. But the truth had shifted this morning. The Americans now possessed a key, not a physical key, but an understanding. They had built a machine that mirrored the Japanese device's internal architecture. They had entered the logic of purple. They could read what had once been unreadable. As the sun finally began to move over the eastern horizon, casting faint streaks of pink and pale gold across the edges of the city, Rockefort stepped back from the table. He ran a hand over his forehead, feeling the dampness of tension leaving his skin. The moment marked the beginning of a new intelligence era, though few beyond this room would learn of it. For now, the knowledge would remain contained within a small circle of individuals sworn to secrecy. The Allies' success in the Pacific would depend on maintaining that secrecy. The destruction that would eventually visit battleships, airfields, transport convoys, and strategic networks across the ocean would be guided in part by what was happening in this basement. The Purple Code was no longer impenetrable, and with its unraveling, the United States had taken its first decisive step into the inner workings of Japan's diplomatic machinery. History rarely announces itself with noise. More often, it enters quietly in dimly lit basements, on paper tapes filled with letters that carry the weight of nations. The machine clicked again, pulling another strip of paper through its rollers. Outside, the city awakened slowly to the coming day. Inside, the war had already changed. To understand what the cracking of the Japanese Purple Code meant to American intelligence, one must look back to the decade before the war, when the patterns of global conflict were still forming, and when cryptography was shifting from a discipline of clever paper puzzles into a science shaped by electricity, mathematics, and the looming threat of international confrontation. Purple did not emerge suddenly as an axiom of Japanese secrecy. It grew out of a long tradition of diplomatic encryption that had evolved with each passing decade. And as Japan's foreign policy became increasingly entangled with expansion, militarization, and alliances that reshaped Asia and the Pacific, the need for a secure communication system intensified. During the early 1930s, Japan's foreign ministry relied heavily on codes based on alphabetical substitutions and mechanical aids that, while effective against casual interception, were vulnerable to more sophisticated cryptanalytic methods. The Japanese leadership, aware that diplomatic messages were routinely monitored by foreign powers, began searching for a system that would render their communications impervious to foreign scrutiny. In 1937, Japanese cryptographers unveiled a new electromechanical cipher device, a step forward from earlier methods, that relied on a complex arrangement of stepping switches, plug boards, and wired permutations. They believed it was unbreakable. The Americans designated this first system Red. Red posed a challenge, but it was not the fortress the Japanese imagined. American cryptanalysts, working quietly in the shadows of the Signal Intelligence Service, SGS, eventually penetrated the logic of the Red Machine. By 1939, the Americans were reading significant portions of Japanese diplomatic traffic, gaining insight into the political maneuvers of a nation whose ambitions were expanding across the Pacific. The breakthrough emboldened American intelligence and unsettled the Japanese. Whether through intercepted rumors or internal suspicion, the Japanese Foreign Ministry became aware that its communications might be compromised. And so a new machine was conceived, one that would surpass the limitations of Red and address every vulnerability. The new device, constructed by Japanese engineers who worked in isolation from military code sections, represented a significant leap in cryptographic ambition. It used a series of telephone-type stepping switches that rotated according to intricate rules, producing a level of encryption far more complex than any earlier system. The machine divided the alphabet into two groups and applied different transformations to each group, creating a level of irregularity that defied traditional frequency analysis. The Japanese believed they had achieved something close to perfection. The Americans called it purple. When the first purple-coded messages were intercepted in 1939 and early 1940, cryptanalysts quickly realized the enormity of the challenge. Unlike Red, whose structure could be mapped through patterns across many messages, Purple appeared to operate with a logic so nonlinear that no amount of manual trial and error could break it. The stepping switches introduced thousands of potential permutations, and without access to the machine itself, the underlying mechanism remained elusive. Traditional decryption methods faltered. For months, American analysts sat before rows of meaningless characters, unable to find the symmetry that usually lurked beneath such systems. What complicated matters further was the parallel growth of global tensions. In Asia, Japan's war with China intensified. Skirmishes along the Manchurian border with the Soviet Union erupted into violent clashes. In Europe, Germany expanded its dominance, drawing the world toward a second global conflict. Diplomatic intelligence became increasingly critical. Purple messages, many of them strategic reports to Japan's embassies abroad, held clues to Japan's political intentions. But their contents remained hidden behind layers of electrical obscurity. Inside the cramped offices of the SAS, the atmosphere was one of fascination mixed with frustration. William Friedman, considered one of the greatest cryptanalysts of the era, oversaw much of the effort to understand Purple. His team included mathematicians, linguists, engineers, and analysts who had trained under his meticulous guidance. The Purple problem consumed them, not because of urgency alone, but because it represented something unprecedented. It was not just a cipher. It was a manifestation of the new age of cryptologic warfare. Friedman's team began to suspect that purple was more than a speech transposition system with variable shifts. They saw hints of logical division within the cipher text, clues suggesting different paths of transformation based on the identity of each letter. But these deductions were like shadows glimpsed through fog, faint, difficult to trust, impossible to confirm. The war in Europe expanded. Japan deepened its alignment with the Axis. American intelligence knew that understanding Japanese intentions could shape future policy. Messages exchanged between Tokyo and its embassies in Berlin and Rome, if deciphered, could reveal critical aspects of the diplomatic triangle forming across continents. The stakes grew as the Pacific situation worsened. Japan's negotiations with the United States, centered on economic sanctions and the status of territories in Asia, became more strained. American analysts knew that diplomatic conversations were only one side of a two-faced policy. Japan spoke with civility through diplomatic channels, but acted with increasing aggression. If purple could be broken, American policymakers might see beyond the public gestures, reading the concealed intentions shaping Japan's strategy. The intelligence community was not blind to the danger of being unprepared. Each unread purple message felt like a missed opportunity, a closed window through which light refused to enter. And yet progress remained painfully slow. The SGS had once broken codes by identifying rhythm, frequency, and combinatorial patterns. Purple required something different, a mechanical imagination. They needed to understand how a machine they had never seen rearranged letters in ways that defied all previous experience. It was as if the Japanese had constructed a safe whose lock changed shape each time it was opened. The work became obsessive. Friedman's health began to falter under the strain. Analysts who had once treated the code as an intellectual challenge grew impatient as world events accelerated. The war in Europe exploded. The Japanese signed a tripartite pact. Rumors of imminent crisis spread. The Americans collected more purple intercepts, filling cabinets with messages whose meaning remained trapped behind the shifting gears of theoretical machinery. And then, gradually, a new approach took form. Not in dramatic revelation, but in the quiet calculations of men who refused to accept defeat. They began to consider building an analog, a machine that could replicate the unknown functions of purple. The idea seemed audacious. How could one reconstruct a device without knowing its internal wiring? But by analyzing the structure of intercepted messages and comparing encrypted text with occasional plaintext references found through diplomatic leaks, the SGS team estimated that purple operated through two parallel paths, one complex, one simple. They deduced that the machine handled vowels differently from consonants. They noticed that certain fragments repeated across different messages when the Japanese reused key settings. This approach, part mechanical intuition, part mathematical logic, marked the turning point. The Americans constructed their own version of purple using telephone stepping switches similar to those used in Japanese communications equipment. They wired, rewired, and recalibrated it endlessly, adjusting its permutations until its outputs began to mimic the pattern seen in intercepted messages. Months passed with no success. Then a sliver of alignment appeared. A small match. A pattern that felt familiar. It was not victory, but it was direction. By the summer of 1940, the stakes had climbed further. European battlefields burned. British cities braced for Luftwaffe bombardment. Japan negotiated with Germany for expanded access to military technology. The United States watched from a distance, knowing that neutrality would not shield it forever. Intelligence became a lifeline, a means of predicting intention before action. Messages sent through purple carried diplomatic sentiment, but also strategic subtext. If the United States could read them, it might understand how Japan positioned itself within the widening conflict. As the intelligence officers refined the machine, a sense of urgency permeated their work. Each adjustment to the stepping switches felt like a move in a game whose stakes were measured in lives and decisions that would shape continents. Then, on that September morning, their efforts crossed the threshold into revelation. The tapes emerging from the machine bore coherent Japanese text. It was the first crack in a wall that had held firm for years. The SDS did not celebrate openly. They understood the significance too well to indulge in triumph. Breaking purple did not end the war. It did not predict Japan's next action. It did not reveal every diplomatic secret at once. But it granted the United States a new form of vision, a glimpse into the intentions of a government whose outward politeness often masked a rapid descent toward war. The stakes were not abstract. They were the lives of sailors who might soon cross the Pacific. They were the decisions of diplomats navigating fragile negotiations. They were the futures of territories Japan might target next. Purple held the potential to transform American awareness from reactive to anticipatory. And now that the machine's logic had been mirrored in a basement beneath Washington, the American intelligence community found itself standing on the edge of a new frontier. The code had not surrendered easily, and the messages it revealed would soon shape the choices leading toward a conflict that approached with slow, unstoppable certainty. The weeks that followed the first successful decryption of a purple message were marked not by celebration, but by an intense struggle to transform a fragile breakthrough into a reliable intelligence system. The machine had spoken once, but for American intelligence to depend on its voice, it would need to speak with consistency. The decoding apparatus, constructed from telephone stepping switches, improvised wiring, and the collective intuition of cryptanalysts, needed refinement. Each message that emerged from the output tape raised new questions. Was the decryption accurate? Were the machine's internal settings perfectly aligned with those of the Japanese device? Was the apparent clarity of the text genuine, or had subtle errors shifted meaning in ways not yet understood? These questions defined the early phase of the conflict between the United States and the Japanese cipher system. It was a conflict waged not on open battlefields, but in dim rooms filled with paper reels, pencils, reference charts, and the constant low hum of electricity. While guns fired in Europe and armies maneuvered across continents, a quieter, more cerebral battle unfolded within the walls of American intelligence. The tension that permeated the work carried the unmistakable urgency of a struggle whose consequences were both invisible and immense. The structure of purple itself contributed to this tension. The Japanese cipher machine was designed to separate letters into two groups, processing each through a different set of internal pathways before recombining them into encrypted output. This division, intended to enhance security, introduced irregularities that confounded early attempts at systematic decoding. The American analog had approximated these pathways, but the precise behavior of the Japanese machine remained hidden. It was possible, indeed likely, that the enemy's device used wiring configurations or stepping intervals that had not yet been replicated. Each decoded message held the potential to expose mismatches in the logic. American intelligence officers began comparing the emergent decrypts with the style and expected content of typical Japanese diplomatic communications. Analysts trained in the nuances of Japanese syntax and government phrasing provided insight into where the machine seemed to diverge from authentic structure. These inconsistencies guided adjustments, allowing engineers to refine the switch patterns and timing intervals of the American-built device. Day after day, incremental improvements pushed the system toward greater accuracy. And with each improvement, the messages became clearer. The early decrypts revealed not war plans or military orders, but the internal workings of Japan's diplomatic network. Embassy requests, intelligence summaries, policy instructions issued from Tokyo. To the casual observer, these messages might have seemed mundane, but to the trained eye, They exposed the outlines of Japanese foreign policy as it strained under the pressures of a world at war. Through them, American analysts saw hints of Japan's tightening alliance with Germany, the deepening conflicts in China, and the political strategies aimed at navigating economic sanctions imposed by the United States. As more messages flowed across the output trays, the American intelligence community began to weave their content into a wider tapestry of global information. They correlated purple decrypts with intercepted communications from German sources, with British intelligence reports, with observations gathered by American diplomats in Asia, and with naval reconnaissance summaries. The mosaic grew larger, revealing patterns that might otherwise have remained concealed. Each intersecting piece of intelligence added context, allowing the United States to understand not only what Japan was doing, but why. Yet conflict arose within the intelligence community itself. The breakthrough had created a delicate situation, one that required absolute secrecy. The purple decrypts had the potential to alter American policy, shape military strategy, and influence diplomatic maneuvers. But if the Japanese discovered their code had been compromised, they would replace it instantly with a more secure system. Maintaining secrecy became as critical as the work of decryption itself. Only a select group of individuals, military leaders, intelligence officers, and selected members of the government, were granted access to the decoded messages. This secrecy caused friction. Some officials demanded broader distribution, arguing that more eyes would allow more accurate analysis. Others insisted that even among those in power, knowledge must be restricted. The intelligence community feared leaks not only from enemy spies, but from those who might unwittingly reveal details through careless conversation or miscommunication. The work conducted in the basement rooms thus existed in a kind of self-imposed isolation. Analysts labored under the weight of understanding that their efforts were critical but could never be widely acknowledged. While this internal conflict simmered in Washington, events across the Pacific grew increasingly volatile. Japanese ambitions accelerated. Their negotiations with the United States continued in a delicate dance of diplomatic wording and political theater, even as Japanese military operations expanded across Asia. Diplomatic messages transmitted through purple became the clearest window into the duality of Japan's intentions. The cordial tone of official conversation contrasted sharply with the aggressive policies shaping the nation's strategic plans. By late 1940, American analysts monitoring purple decrypts began noticing subtle shifts. Tokyo's instructions to its embassies grew more urgent. References to Germany and Italy became more frequent, suggesting a tightening ideological alignment. Discussions of resource shortages, especially oil and raw materials, revealed a mounting strategic crisis. Japan's plans to secure access to these resources, whether through diplomacy or expansion, became increasingly explicit. The decrypts hinted at future moves in Southeast Asia, at negotiations with Thailand, at pressure exerted on French Indochina. These were not idle observations. They were signals of a nation preparing for confrontation. The American government found itself caught between competing interpretations. Some officials believed Japan could be deterred through negotiation. Others believed war was inevitable, regardless of diplomatic language. Purple messages added nuance to both positions. They exposed the calculated politeness of Japan's diplomatic tone, which masked internal deliberations that leaned toward force rather than compromise. They revealed the divisions within Japan's own leadership, the foreign ministry seeking stability, the military faction pushing for expansion. As this intelligence accumulated, American analysts recognized that purple held a paradoxical role in the emerging conflict. It provided clarity where none had existed before, yet it also complicated decision-making. The decrypts did not predict Japan's actions with certainty. They merely illuminated possibilities. policymakers still needed to interpret intentions, weigh risks, and consider responses. Each message was another fragment to be fitted into an already complex picture. This period became one of mounting tension. The intelligence community sensed that the world was inching toward a precipice. Purple provided glimpses of the direction in which events were moving, but the speed and timing remained uncertain. As Japan expanded its influence across Asia, and as American embargoes tightened economic pressure, the messages transmitted between Tokyo and its embassies took on greater urgency. They spoke of timelines, strategic concerns, and the need to prepare for unforeseen developments. They echoed with a tone of inevitability. The internal conflict reached its height as American policymakers confronted a difficult question. How deeply should the United States trust the intelligence produced by a machine that had been reverse-engineered in a basement? Confidence in Purple grew with each accurate decrypt, but the gravity of the situation demanded caution. Decisions informed by intelligence could change the course of history. Any error, no matter how small, could ripple outward into catastrophic consequences. Yet the decrypts continued to prove their reliability. They revealed Japan's discussions with German officials regarding technology and strategic cooperation. They exposed diplomatic maneuvering in Moscow as Japan sought to stabilize its northern borders. They provided insight into how Japan interpreted American policies, often misjudging the willingness of the United States to respond forcefully to aggression. These misunderstandings, visible only through decrypted text, hinted at the widening gulf between diplomatic pretense and military reality. By late 1941, the intelligence war had shifted again. Purple messages revealed increasing impatience within Tokyo. Instructions to its embassies became more direct. References to deadlines and situations developing appeared with growing frequency. American cryptanalysts, reading these messages, understood the implication. Japan was preparing for something decisive. Purple had transformed from a puzzle into a warning system. The conflict between intelligence and action intensified. The United States could see Japan's diplomatic posture hardening, could observe its military aligning for operations across the Pacific, could infer that negotiations were little more than a veneer masking strategic intent. But the decrypts did not specify targets. They did not reveal the exact nature of Japan's next move. They provided context but not certainty. This uncertainty became the defining tension of the intelligence campaign. The Americans held a powerful tool, an unprecedented ability to peer into Japan's diplomatic communications. But they still lacked the final piece, the explicit details of Japan's plans. Purple revealed intent, but intent alone could not shape policy. The military needed actionable intelligence. The government needed clarity. And the codebreakers needed one decisive message to transform fragments into a coherent forecast. That message had not yet arrived, but the signs, drawn from weeks of decrypts, pointed toward a moment when the internal conflict of intelligence, secrecy, and interpretation would collide with the violent reality of war. Purple had been broken, but the consequences of understanding would soon collide with the consequences of action. The climax of the Purple story did not arrive with fanfare or public declaration. It came quietly, in the early hours of winter mornings and in the dim lamplight of intelligence rooms where analysts bent over messages that carried more weight than any weapon yet deployed in the Pacific. As the year 1941 deepened toward its final, decisive month, the decrypts emerging from the American-built Purple machine grew increasingly urgent. Their tone shifted subtly, then unmistakably. What had once been diplomatic routine became a cascade of signals, each one sharper, more compressed, more charged with the energy of imminent decision. The Japanese Foreign Ministry sent instructions with increased frequency to its embassies around the world. The tempo of communication quickened, and the structure of the messages became more segmented. Analysts noticed changes in the rhythm of phrasing, the way references to negotiations appeared with forced optimism, while underlying directives spoke of preparations and contingencies. Terms that had once seemed benign acquired new significance. Deadlines that had been ambiguous previously now bore the unmistakable weight of strategic planning. It was in this rising tide of encoded urgency that the true climax unfolded. Purple, once a cryptographic mystery, began revealing messages that were no longer simply diplomatic in nature. They were markers of a nation transitioning from negotiation to intention. They were the threads that bound Japan's strategic planning to its diplomatic posture. And as they became clearer, the gap between the two widened into a chasm visible to anyone with the patience and vision to understand it. Inside the cramped intelligence rooms, the atmosphere thickened with a pressure that had nothing to do with the heat of the equipment or the enclosed air. Analysts felt it in their skin, in the way their stomachs tightened as they fed new intercepts into the machine. The device clicked and hummed with its usual mechanical steadiness, but each line of output that emerged carried a gravity that pressed on the room like a descending weight. The decrypts no longer provided only fragments of political sentiment. They hinted at coordinated timelines, concealed objectives, and the narrowing horizon of peace. The first unmistakable sign came in late November. A series of instructions from Tokyo directed its embassies to implement extraordinary security measures for coded messages, demanding that certain sections be destroyed immediately after use. Analysts reading the decrypted text recognized the implication. Japan expected its diplomatic channels to lose safety. Only a nation preparing for a drastic shift in relations would instruct its embassies to purge sensitive material in anticipation of forced evacuation or seizure. As these messages accumulated, the American intelligence community tightened its focus. The purple machine became the center of a widening analytical effort. Every decrypted phrase was examined not simply for its literal content, but for its tone, its timing, and the subtle cues embedded within its structure. Analysts compare the messages to Japan's recent military movements, the massing of troops in southern Indochina, the quiet redeployment of naval units to staging areas, the persistent negotiation deadlock with the United States. The composite picture that emerged was one of a nation preparing not merely for war, but for a coordinated strike whose scope remained concealed behind layers of diplomatic calm. In early December, the tension reached a new peak. A message decoded by the purple machine contained a directive that Tokyo's embassies should expect detailed instructions to arrive in multiple sections, each marked with numbered headings. The decrypt made clear that these instructions would require careful handling and rapid implementation. The analysts recognized the structure immediately. This was not routine communication. It was the preparation for a critical diplomatic maneuver. The next days passed in a slow, relentless accumulation of signs. One message ordered Japanese diplomats to cease using the purple machine for routine correspondence and to restrict its use to only the most essential transmissions. Another instructed embassies to begin destroying files related to cryptographic systems. A third requested updates on the physical layout of embassy facilities, the placement of safes, the structure of basements, the capacity for rapid burning of documents. Taken individually, these messages were ambiguous. Together, they formed a pattern so stark that even the most cautious analysts felt the chill of recognition. Japan was preparing for something irreversible, something that would sever diplomatic communication, something that would render embassies vulnerable to immediate search or seizure. The decrypt that carried the final weight arrived in the early hours of December 6th. Analysts fed the intercepted traffic into the machine as they had done countless times before. The output tape advanced slowly, revealing the segments of a long, multi-part message. Each section carried a fragment of meaning, and as the analysts pieced them together, the the shape of Tokyo's intention solidified. The message instructed the Japanese embassy in Washington to prepare for the termination of negotiations. It described the need to deliver a final communication at a precise time. It emphasized confidentiality, urgency, and the precise coordination of actions across multiple embassies. The analysts reading the decrypt understood what this meant. They knew that Japan had set a deadline, one that aligned with earlier references in the purple intercepts. And they knew, with a certainty that cut through the room like cold steel, that the delivery of this message would coincide with a decisive action taken elsewhere. It was not merely a diplomatic withdrawal. It was the prelude to an attack. The tension in the intelligence rooms thickened into something palpable. Messages came in one after another, as if the machine itself were straining to keep pace with the acceleration of history. Analysts who had spent months wrestling with abstractions now faced the reality that their work had become a conduit for warnings that the nation might not fully comprehend until it was too late. The purple decrypts had become a mirror through which American intelligence could see the shape of an event approaching with unstoppable force. The final sections of the Japanese message were decrypted late in the evening. They instructed the embassy staff to destroy all sensitive materials immediately after delivering the communication. They required that the message be delivered at precisely 1 o'clock Washington time. And though the text did not explicitly state what would follow, the analysts who read it recognized the pattern from earlier diplomatic precedents. Japan would terminate talks, and the termination would not come as an isolated gesture. It would accompany action. The room fell into a deep, heavy stillness. Each man present understood that whatever was coming had already been set in motion. Across the Pacific, fleets were already moving. Decisions had been made. The messages now emerging from the purple machine were echoes of choices already executed. Time, which had once stretched between intercepts like a flexible medium, had now hardened into something unyielding. Events were converging. Outside, the winter night lay thick and quiet over Washington. Street lamps glowed faintly along the cold pavement. The wind carried the sharp scent of impending snow. But within the intelligence rooms, the air felt dense, warmed by machines, colored by the knowledge that an inflection point in history had been reached. The analysts who had labored in obscurity, who had given months of their lives to understanding the logic of a foreign machine, now found themselves holding fragments of a truth too large to grasp fully. Japan's diplomatic mask had cracked. The Purple Code, once a fortress of secrecy, had revealed the intentions hidden behind polite phrasing and ceremonial language. An American intelligence, reading these intentions in the quiet hours before dawn, understood that war was no longer a distant possibility. It was imminent. The climax of the intelligence struggle arrived not in shouts or alarms, but in the silent turning of a paper reel, in the slow emergence of text that carried the weight of nations. The purple machine had spoken. The truth stood clear. Within hours, the world would change. The hours that followed the final purple decrypt carried a stillness that did not match the nearing storm. In the early morning of December 7th, 1941, Washington remained wrapped in the brittle quiet of a winter dawn. Frost touched the edges of windows along the Potomac. The sky hung low and pale, as though the daylight hesitated before breaking through. Inside the intelligence buildings, however, the walls themselves seemed tense, as if aware of what the decoded messages implied even before the analysts gave them shape. The decrypts lay on tables in neat stacks, their meaning unmistakable now that the full picture had taken form. But the events these messages predicted had not yet revealed themselves to the world outside. The analysts moved through the rooms with restrained urgency, carrying transcripts, compiling summaries, and preparing briefings for senior officials. The air carried an undercurrent of dread. not in the form of panic, but in the solemn realization that the transition from warning to catastrophe might already be underway somewhere across the ocean. The intelligence teams understood the importance of every minute, yet they also understood the limits of their role. They could decipher, interpret, and present, but they could not alter the timeline that had been set in motion. The messages deconstructed by the Purple Machine were artifacts of decisions made days earlier by a nation intent on forcing the world to bend to its strategy. As the sun rose slowly over the capital, painting the cold sky in muted tones of gold and gray, the senior officials who received the decrypt summaries recognized the magnitude of what they held. The final Japanese communication, delivered to the Washington embassy, was the culmination of a series of diplomatic signals that had grown steadily more ominous over weeks. It was not a declaration of war, but it carried the unmistakable cadence of one. The analysts had done their part. The intelligence was clear, yet the exact shape of what was coming remained beyond their reach. The purple decrypts revealed intention, preparation, and timing, but they withheld the final detail: the location where Japan's decisive blow would fall. The world, however, did not wait for comprehension. Even as Washington prepared to address the implications of the decrypts, events thousands of miles away were already unfolding with irreversible momentum. The Japanese fleet, moving in silence across the vast Pacific, had reached its strike position. Aircraft warmed on deck. Engines rumbled. Pilots prepared to launch. The coded orders that directed these actions had not passed through purple systems and therefore eluded American cryptanalysis. The intelligence teams in Washington could sense the convergence of decisions, but not the precise point at which they would erupt into violence. When the first reports arrived, disjointed, uncertain, delivered through crackling radio channels, they shattered the fragile barrier between decoded warning and living reality. The initial fragments spoke of explosions, smoke, and aircraft bearing the red insignia of the rising sun. The reports were incomplete, but their meaning required no interpretation. A fleet had attacked Pearl Harbor. The long-suspected break in peace had arrived. The warnings embedded within the purple messages had found their culmination in the destruction unfolding in Hawaiian waters. In the intelligence rooms, the news settled over the analysts with a weight so heavy it seemed to press the breath from their chests. They had seen the signs, traced the intention, and interpreted the diplomatic signals. But the precise moment and location had remained hidden, locked behind military communication systems that purple could not touch. For a moment, the analysts felt suspended between two realities: the cold precision of decoded text and the visceral shock of unfolding catastrophe. The transition from theory to consequence occurred in an instant, carried across the ocean on the wings of radio transmissions. The hours after the attack unfolded in a blur of motion. Senior officials moved swiftly. Military commands realigned. Diplomatic channels collapsed. Across the nation, stunned disbelief gave way to the unifying force of outrage and determination. Yet within the intelligence community, amidst the flurry of directives and the tight knot of urgency, there is also a profound and quiet understanding of the role that purple would now play in the war ahead. The code-breaking effort, which had once been centered on diplomatic nuance, had become a vital instrument in the struggle to anticipate Japan's future moves. In the days that followed, the decrypts gained new significance. Messages that had previously seemed concerned only with diplomatic posturing now became indicators of larger strategic intent. They revealed the thinking of Japanese officials as they attempted to manage international reactions, coordinate alliance strategies, and assess the consequences of their actions. The United States, still stunned by the suddenness of the attack, now possessed a tool that provided a glimpse into the internal deliberations of its adversary's leadership. It did not erase the shock of Pearl Harbor. It did not diminish the human cost, but it offered something invaluable: insight The intelligence community adapted quickly. The purple machine, once a curiosity born from theoretical deduction, became an essential element of wartime analysis. Every intercepted message was fed into the machine with the same urgency one might reserve for battlefield reports. Each output was scrutinized for indicators, clues, or patterns that could inform military planning. The messages that passed through purple channels remained diplomatic in nature, yet they interacted constantly with Japan's military ambitions. By reading them, American analysts could track shifts in alliances, anticipate political developments, and identify points of strategic pressure. As the months passed, the war evolved into a vast and complex conflict stretching from the jungles of Southeast Asia to the skies above the Pacific, from the deserts of North Africa to the frozen northern seas. The cracking of purple did not win battles, but it shaped the environment in which those battles were fought. It informed negotiations with allies, influenced military deployments, and revealed the thinking behind Japan's diplomatic engagements with Germany and other Axis powers. It provided a measure of foresight in a war defined by uncertainty. Yet, even as purple became an instrument of strategic advantage, the intelligence community never forgot the limitations exposed in the days leading to Pearl Harbor. The decrypts were powerful, but incomplete. They did not capture military orders or operational planning. They provided insight into Japan's diplomatic posture, not its tactical intentions. The Americans learned to interpret purple messages with a dual awareness. They held immense value, but only when integrated with other forms of intelligence: radio intercepts, reconnaissance, human reporting, and battlefield observation. The resolution of the purple story lay not in a single moment of triumph, but in the quiet, persistent influence the decrypts exerted on the course of the war. They accompanied the United States into every major campaign, offering context for Japan's political moves, revealing fractures within the Axis alliance, and shedding light on diplomatic tensions that would later shape peace negotiations. They formed part of the invisible architecture supporting the Allied war effort, a structure built not from steel or concrete, but from understanding. When the war finally began to shift decisively in the Allies' favor, the significance of purple deepened once again. As Japan's military suffered losses across the Pacific, at Midway, in the Solomon Islands, in the Philippines, the tone of purple messages grew increasingly strained. Analysts could see the transformation in the language itself. Instructions from Tokyo became sharper, directives more urgent, and references to negotiation more carefully phrased. Diplomatic attempts to manage international perception revealed the growing desperation beneath Japan's outward resolve. The decrypts also documented the gradual unraveling of Japan's alliance with Germany, as conflicting priorities and shifting strategies strained the partnership. American intelligence followed these developments with close attention, recognizing that diplomatic fractures often preceded military setbacks. Through purple, they observed the subtle reorientation of Japan's strategy as it moved from expansion to preservation, and finally to the grim acceptance that defeat might be inevitable. When the war ended in 1945, the intelligence community that had labored in secrecy for years found itself standing at the threshold of a new era. The world had changed. Nations had been reshaped, and the role of intelligence, once confined to narrow corridors and dim-lit rooms, had expanded into a cornerstone of modern warfare. The breaking of purple had been one of the early battles in this transformation, a conflict defined not by weapons, but by logic and insight, by the ability to pierce through silence and uncover meaning. In the years that followed, the story of purple remained largely hidden from the public. It was overshadowed by the broader narratives of the war, by battles fought and victories won. Yet among those who had worked within the intelligence community, the memory endured. They remembered the long nights, the intricate diagrams, the tentative successes, and the profound tension of reading messages that illuminated a path to war mere hours before the world plunged into it. They remembered the realization that understanding does not always grant the power to prevent catastrophe, but it can provide the foundation upon which future resilience is built. The final legacy of Purple lay not in the decrypts themselves, but in the proof they offered of what human ingenuity could accomplish when confronted with the opaque machinery of conflict. The analysts who reconstructed the Japanese cipher machine without ever seeing it did so through intuition, logic, and a refusal to yield to complexity. They demonstrated that even in a world expanding toward mechanized warfare, the mind remained a formidable force. As the decades passed, the significance of their achievement became clearer. The breaking of Purple had been a quiet triumph, overshadowed by the noise of war, but essential to understanding the currents beneath the surface of global events. It marked a moment when the invisible battles of intelligence intersected with the visible battles of nations. And in that intersection, it revealed a truth that would guide the future of cryptology. Every code, no matter how complex, carries within it the possibility of understanding. The intelligence rooms eventually grew silent. The machines were dismantled or archived. The reels of paper, once vital, faded with age. But the story remained, a testament to the power of persistence, to the burden of knowledge, and to the quiet resolve of those who worked in shadows to illuminate the intentions that shaped a world at war. And in that silence, long after the conflict had ended, the echoes of those early decrypts lingered, reminders of a moment when the turning of a paper reel revealed the approach of history itself.